be speaking on advances in bronchoscopy for enhanced lesion visibility, seeing the unseen. He's an interventional pulmonologist at Narayana Health City, Bangalore. We're very glad to have you here, sir. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Nagarjuna, for inviting me for this Nodule Summit. It's both an honor and I'm also a little anxious because I'm the only person holding this audience out here before lunch. So I'll try to keep it as quick as possible because a lot of what I'm going to be talking is actually built up by the entire framework for my talk is built up by Professor Oki in the talk below, in the talk before mine. I'm going to be talking about seeing the unseen. So I'm going to give a little bit of a different perspective to what we are currently doing and what is possible to do or what can be expanded into. So that's the whole idea of this talk. I come from Narayana Vidyalaya. This is the hospital from where I come. It's on the outskirts of Bangalore. On the left you see the cardiac sciences building and the other building is the one from where we operate upon. And that's Professor Hideo Saka for you. And of course, this is his conflict of interest. That's how his, jumbo jet will look like, and mine is pretty straightforward. But importantly, I'd like to give credits to my good friend Balu, from whom I learn a lot, Zeshang, who's also a good friend, and Hideo Saka, from whom some of his slides are part of this presentation. But before I go into this very philosophical talk in some sense, there is also realism in it. I think it's important to remember what St. Augustine said. Faith is to believe what you do not see. The reward for this faith is to see what you believe. And for those of you who don't understand what St. Augustine said, because I didn't understand it initially, I think the talk will make it a little more clearer. Our story starts from 2011, and I think Sameer Bansal has spoken about this very interesting paper, the National Lung Cancer Screening Trial. This trial basically established low-dose CT for lung cancer, and it basically demonstrated a 20% relative reduction in mortality for lung cancer and a 6.7% all-cause mortality. And this is where every single company started pumping in their newer technologies to go behind pulmonary nodules. And the reason why we went behind pulmonary nodules is catching them early means you're catching lung cancer in early stages. That means you're going in with a curative intent treatment rather than a palliative intent treatment. Now, this is the entire spectrum in some sense of what is available for an interventional pulmonologist to go, right? So, of course, there is the transthoracic biopsy that can be done, but bronchoscopically, this is how you can classify every single tool. So, basically, you can classify tools as purely tools which will help you maneuver through the lung. So, that's what I call maneuverability technique, and therefore, you have the ultra thin bronchoscope out there, and of course, different tools like the curate, the extended working channel with the locatable glide, etc., etc. There are pure navigational techniques like the virtual bronchoscopic navigation like lung point, etc. And then of course there is the conformational technique, and most often we use the radial probebus with or without guide sheet, with or without fluoroscopy. So that's basically standard. But there are some techniques which can overlap, and electromagnetic navigation is both a maneuverability technique because the locatable guide can move, and it's also a navigational technique. And a cone beam CT can be both navigational technique and a conformational technique. So that's basically how you will see the entire spectrum of what is available for a bronchoscopist. So this is just a basic thing to understand. But ladies and gentlemen, what I'm talking today about is the conformational techniques, and for a very, very long time we've had radial probebus. So whenever you go, or whatever technique you use to go and reach the nodule, you end up in trying to use your radial probebus to confirm it, right? So whether you use ultra thin bronchoscope, a virtual bronchoscopic navigation, or electromagnetic navigation, before you sample you always confirm it radial by using the radial probe. What then is the radial probe? The radial probe has been the staple diet for a conformational technique for many, many years. It was at the center stage for a very long time, it still is. There's a very big difference between navigation and a diagnostic yield. You may be able to navigate to the lesion, but when you sample it, your yield may or may not be right. And of course, the yield of a nodule depends on many things like size, location, type, and if there is any atelectasis. So these are important considerations, and the probe that we've used traditionally is the 17S probe with a 1.4 mm diameter. So that's basically what is important. For this probe, we developed different tools. We developed guide sheets, we developed curates, we developed brushes, etc., etc. And this is a photographs from Professor Oki's paper itself. But what is important is, since we required this radial probe to go through our bronchoscope and we had to go more and more peripheral, what we decided to do in our quest to reach these peripheral nodules is we started making our bronchoscopes thinner, slimmer, and in some cases you can even call sexier. So that's basically what we did. So what is the current staple diet? Like what Professor Oki has shown us is the current standard is these two bronchoscopes, which is currently the best available in the market. One with the 1.7 mm is something that is the current standard, current gold standard in many ways. But my talk is, can we go beyond this really? And this is a paper which sir has already showed. This was a paper which was published during 2015 during my training. So it was a big honor for me to stand after Professor Oki talking about this paper. And basically these are photographs from this paper from 2015, and we're talking about something which is 9 years ago, and this is when it was published. And Professor Oki at that time made a very simple contribution to what we already know. So you use a bronchoscope, you have to go too far and take a biopsy. The other choice is you use a thin bronchoscope, and what you then do with a thin bronchoscope is you use a guide sheath and go a little further, because the thinner scope allows you to go further down into the airway, and then you are able to biopsy it. But if you used an ultra thin scope, you didn't have to use a guide sheath and you could go as close to the lesion as possible. So that's basically what this slide is trying to tell you. The entire study can be summed up in very simple terms with this diagram, and this is basically Professor Hideo Saka's slide. But lung is not very simple and it's very, very complex, and you had both Balu and Vatsar this morning telling you about the bronchial branch tracing technique, 1AI, alpha X, etc., etc. And of course, we've developed both the manual mapping, which Balu dealt with and Vatsar dealt with, and then we have the navigation as well. Now what we have after radial probe is a newer technology, and now we're talking about tool in lesion confirmation. And there's a lot of discussion in the morning also about if you breathe, what happens. So basically, this is how the technique looks like. On your cone beam CT, you're trying to look at it in 3 dimensions, and you get to that particular lesion. But not all is rosy with this particular technique. What looks straightforward is sometimes not really straightforward, and that's basically how some problems were overcome. And then this problem was overcome in many ways by using the fluoroscopies that were available. And then body vision, another important technology, came in. It started getting into available equipment in our bronchoscopy suites with fluoroscopy, etc. And then we started getting better images, and it also had a component of AI, which basically meant that it learnt with every single procedure and helped you further. So now what is the current state of art? The state of art is either you combine sometimes cone beam CT with body vision, or even the robots are getting combined with it, right? So now I am proposing a completely different alternative to what we already know. We know radial probe, EBUS is a conformational technique and a tool in lesion, but I am proposing, can we use an ultra thin bronchoscope and make it a conformational technique? So can we go even thinner, even slimmer to do it? The earliest of such reports started coming in way back in 1994, when bronchoscope actually went and saw cavities, right? So these are reports you see from time to time in literature. And as recently as 2024, there's an interesting paper where somebody actually went to the periphery of the lung and were able to visualize this particular cavity. So these kind of reports are available and they are already seen. But interestingly, this was a very important letter to the editor, which was published by a group from Japan, Kinoshita, and they interestingly had a very important device which they developed called the laser eye ultra thin fibroscope, and the diameter, gentlemen, is basically 0.97. So basically that's what is the diameter we're trying to look at. And these are the lesions that they've been able to access with a 0.97 fibroscope. It's as thin as your hair, and they've been able to go to the most peripheral aspects of the lung to be able to visualize them. Again, I'm emphasizing we are only visualizing these lesions, not biopsying them as yet. So what has this paper very importantly concluded is that forget a bronchoscope, you can construct a biopsy forceps with this particular fiber and you can take biopsies. So that's basically what you want to do. You can use, you can combine it with suction and probably be able to take pointed secretions or a catheter directed ball in some sense. You can integrate this particular fiber with the currently available navigation systems and it will help you. The other interesting aspect we are also talking about is this is a laser fiber, and therefore you can use photosynthesizers and you can expand it to do something like a photodynamic therapy, and of course you can even irradiate with it. So basically we are talking about a gamut of things that can happen with a 0.97 mm probe. The very same group has also published in 2019 a very interesting paper, And what they basically did is put this fiber through a bronchoscope and demonstrated some effects. Interestingly, this is another device, the spyglass device, usually used by our gastro colleagues, and you can see the fiber that is there for this to visualize lesions. So what you're seeing in the first picture is basically the carina, and the second one is an extrinsic compression in one of the peripheral areas of the lung. They basically had 15 patients. This was a Canadian paper, and they used a radial probe EBUS first to locate it, and then basically they visualized these lesions. And the spyglass fiber was able to visualize it in 14 of the 15 cases, and there were recorded abnormal in 7. The time for recording was about 6.5 minutes, and this is what basically the spyglass fiber looks like. The new kid on the block right now is a very interesting thing called the iris scope. So basically the iris scope is currently a 1.3 millimeter video endoscopy probe. It's got very good clarity and basically was actually apparently shown at the recent ERS as well, and this is basically the commercially available 1.3 mm probe as of now. And they looked at Sami Lachkar and his group basically looked at a very interesting study from Jan-Feb this year with 23 patients, and they basically inserted iris probe to localize lesions. They looked for tumoral, suspicious, normal and non-specific lesions, and this was a really good study. These are some pictures from that particular study where they have been able to access much peripheral lesions and been able to demonstrate visually these lesions actually. So what I'm actually asking or proposing is, can ultra-thin bronchoscope going forward with more developments become a conformational technique? These are pictures which I've taken yesterday at my bronchoscopy suite. These are the two bronchoscopes that Professor Oki's study from 2015 shows, which is the current state of art, the MP190 and the P190. And those are some of the other newer, even more thinner, slimmer and sleeker scopes that are available. So what are these basic scopes that are available and what can one do? This is basically the Wathen scope, which I have actually shown you in the photos, and this is basically the zero and the slim scope. The zero scope is something which does not have a channel, and the slim scope has a 1.2 mm channel with a 3.2 mm external diameter. And this is Professor Saka's definition of thin or ultra thin bronchoscope. We're not basically talking about the regular, we're talking about ultra thin and even ultra thin scopes at this particular point in time. What are the current scopes available in the Indian market? This is the entire list of scopes, and of course I think most of you are familiar because some of these are already available. But yes, the Wathen scope, the Visi scope and the Fuji scopes are the ones which are available now, and they have good channel diameters for us to be able to visualize the lesion as well. Of course, like Professor Oki has just alluded to in the previous talk, a 1.2 mm channel may be difficult, tools for it are difficult to get, but you still do have tools and you can biopsy. So that's basically what is important. So the take home for my talk, basically the smallest commercially available scope today, the iris scope, is 1.3 mm diameter, still does not have any channel for us to biopsy. But in India, as far as it's concerned, we still get a 2.2 mm and we can go to the periphery of the lung. My take to the question, are we there yet? We aren't, but soon will probably be. Integration with tools is a very, very big need. Can we have make in India approaches is something that we need to consider. And of course, navigation, cone beam CT, robots, body vision versus manual mapping. I think still manual mapping is something that wins. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I leave you with this very interesting thought. There are those who will say that seeing is believing. I am telling you that believing is seeing. This is by Neil Walsh. Thank you.